Oh, actually, she had another meeting at this time. I remember now. Okay. She wasn't sure if she'd be able to get out of it, and it looks like she wasn't. So we're going to talk about using NotebookLM or Google Illuminate. We'll focus a little bit more on NotebookLM. It seems to be a little bit more developed in some ways to create podcasts. And to get a copy of the slides, either type in that URL or grab the, or aim your camera at that little QR code there, and I will also drop it into chat. Okay, so if you get a copy of it, you can follow along a little bit. There's several examples in here, as well as some very simple instructions. It's remarkably easy to use. NotebookLM is a tool from Google, and I hope it sticks around. One of the problems we sometimes run in with Google tools is they develop something really powerful, and then it disappears a year or two later, or sometimes a month or two later. But I suspect this is something that they're going to continue, if not in this form, then perhaps in some other, integrated into some of their other tools, because many things come back later in different forms. And basically what it does is it takes material you feed it, and the material you feed it could be PDF files, just text documents, markdown files, Google Docs or slides, websites, or public YouTube videos with transcripts, because it is basing us off the transcript, or audio files. And you can include up to 20 different files in the process. And I put a link in with Markdown because that's something we don't use quite as much, but it is a common way of marking up some text. And what I'd like you to do is to try this, to work along with this and try it yourself. And go to the site, notebooklm.google.com, but sign in with a personal Gmail account because it is blocked for the college. It's not part of the original Google Suite, and it takes time before the college turns on some of these features. It's a completely free feature, a free tool, and it's pretty powerful. But for now, you have to use it with a personal account. Then find some material that you'd like to use as a basis for a podcast. And in there, you'll see on the left side of the screen, a create new, and then just drag or drop selected files. So I'm just going to open that up just so you can see it. If you're not following along, I'm already set up to be logged into a personal account here. And you go right to here, as long as you're using your own account. And I just created a few of these last night. One based on the Candlemaker petition, a PDF from, or actually, I think it's a text document from Bastiat way back, a couple hundred years. Another article from the Chronicle of Higher Ed by Vijayasathi Micheli Hogan. And I also took our podcast from last week, or actually the current podcast, which came out Wednesday, and put it in. So it created a podcast based on the audio file that was a podcast. So and if you want to create a new one, you just click Create New. You upload your sources or choose the files. And again, they could be URLs, they could be PDFs, text, markdown, etc. And if you notice, you can go down here to directly get things from Google Docs or Google Slides. You could insert links by clicking on one of these, or you could just paste in text. Or again, you could drag and drop the file into that area. So it takes a few minutes to do it. So I think we're going to skip over that part, at least for now, and we can come back to that. But try that. And well, actually, come to think of it, it might be good to get it started. So I'm going to go out here and go to, let's say we want to go to the Chronicle of Higher Ed, just to see if there's anything new there we might want to learn more about. And let's hop over there.
Is there a file size limit, or is it just a certain number of files?
It's limited to a maximum of 20 files, but there is some type of limitation because I tried putting in videos from some of the workshop recordings that we've done on AI to see how it might summarize that. And each of them individually was too big for it to analyze. So I'm not sure what the size restriction is, but there is some. With text files and PDFs, they're relatively small, so you probably could get up to 20 of them in there. But with video, it's a little bit more, it does take up a lot more storage, and that may be why it was not working for me, because I was wondering the same thing. But certainly you could put in a whole book, an OER textbook, for example, and you could get a summary of that. That's probably a larger chunk than you might want. But well, let's see. Let's put in, let's skip that. We have to deal with that enough. And let's see. Let's go to enrollment's big rebound, which is somewhat a positive thing. So I'm just going to grab that URL, copy it, and go back over here to the notebook thing. And we're going to go down here and put in a link to a website. And any YouTube files have to be publicly available. And here we go. So we have the source. Now, if we want, we could tweak it a little bit. We could put in some questions we want it to address if we want it to be a little bit more focused. But these are the things by default that it's going to look at. And so I'm just going to click on this to get it started. And then I'm going to click on over here, generate, because this is what creates the actual podcast. And this customize feature has expanded a bit since then. So again, you could ask the host to focus on a specific thing, but since I haven't read that article, I can't really be sure what we should focus on. So we're just going to click generate and let it run a little bit in the background. And it will be ready. And with an article, it'll probably take about 3 or 4 minutes. With the podcast, it took about 7 or 8 minutes for it to come back. Depending on the amount of the material, it does vary a little bit, but it works in the background. So if you could try doing the same thing, and then we'll come back and look at this once it's done. But there's some examples I put in just to show you how it worked. I took this week's Tea for Teaching podcast with Allison Rank in political science and some of her colleagues, and just play it for a couple seconds.
Class discussions of public policy issues can be challenging in a politically polarized environment. In this episode, we discuss a new resource that suggests a variety of strategies that encourage
the idea of this book. Kara was probably elbowing me in the nice home and name it in quite as explicit way as Allison just.
Okay, we don't really need to focus on this so much, but this is a podcast with 4 people who were speaking, or 5 people who were speaking. And what it does is, if we go back over here, it created an audio overview. It created a briefing document summarizing it. It created a timeline on what was said at various points, created a 2-person podcast, and it also created a study guide and quiz. I think we can go back actually and take a look at some of those things. So if we go back to the, here we go. So if we go back to the starting point here, and this was the civic pedagogies one. Here, I was just playing around with it. So there's a variety of things here, but here's a timeline. It'll add a note with the timeline in it. It's generating that. It looks like it regenerates it each time you do it. But here's a timeline and cast of characters. It misspelled some of them. I'm not quite sure why. Apparently it was using the audio rather than the transcript. But it shows you what happens in a sequence order. And it misspelled all of our names and so forth. But in any case, that's not the main reason why you'd use this. So I'm just going to trash that anyway. Yeah, we don't really need that note. But if we go back to, if we go back here, I wanted to show the, I've jumped too far back. So let's go again to civic pedagogies here. And let's look at the study guide. And here's what it does is, well, I must have clicked this last night, but in any case, we can try this. So it asks you to check your understanding of it, and then it will evaluate that. So after you've listened to it, it gives you these questions, and then it does give an answer key. So it creates some questions and it creates some responses. which is kind of interesting because this is a tool that some students have already started to use, and it's likely we'll be seeing more and more students use it because it can take whole books or several articles and summarize them in a pretty simple form, provide some notes, an overview of it, and basically a pretty decent summary of what was discussed. And here, by the way, in the study guide and quiz, it does much better with the actual spelling and grammar and so forth. Yeah, so that actually must be based off the transcript, I suspect. It even
So John,
italicizes the book title. Yes.
so John, when I used it last month, what I did was I actually attached a whole book, which was like 600-page book, and I wanted to see how much it does well in terms of a podcast. And what I realized was it was like, I believe it was like a 15-minute, approximately 15-minute podcast. Is there a way I can actually make it longer? Because if the book is more dense, I would prefer that it gives more details in the podcast, or shorter if there is a need. Can it be?
Right now, it only tends to create podcasts of roughly that length. So you probably would want to put in smaller chunks. So you might have a chapter of the book or a section of the book and so forth. Because with a whole book summary, there's not going to be a lot of detail. But if it's a summary of one concept in the book, that can do it pretty nicely. And actually, let's take a look at what it did create here in terms of the civic. Oh, that was the sources. Okay, never mind. Let's go back to here and see if we can get out of there. And here's a conversation. It takes a little bit of time, just a few seconds, to load that conversation. Just so that way it'll be ready to stream. But this is what it created as a podcast.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something I know a lot of you are thinking about: civic engagement. Especially, well, in today's world with all the political stuff, it can be kind of overwhelming, right?
Oh yeah, definitely.
But you've all sent us some amazing resources, articles, research, even a whole podcast episode that really gets into the nitty-gritty. We're going to be focusing on that episode from T for Teaching, where they had those editors from the book Civic Pedagogies.
Yeah, the book's called Civic Pedagogies, Teaching Civic Engagement in an Era of Divisive Politics. So, pretty relevant.
Exactly. Think of this deep dive as your cheat sheet to figuring out how to actually have those productive conversations about anything, really, even when things get a little heated.
Yeah, it's like we're giving you the VIP backstage pass to navigating those tricky waters.
Okay, so let's jump right in. One thing that really struck me in that podcast was how they just went straight for it. They didn't shy away from talking about political polarization.
Yeah.
What were your thoughts on how they tackled that?
Well, what I found fascinating was instead of tiptoeing around it, they just named it right up front. Like, hey, this is a challenge. This is something we need to address. And they said that was the first step.
Okay, so they named it. But I mean, naming it doesn't magically make the problem go away.
Right, definitely not. It's just the beginning, right? They then go on to talk about all these strategies.
Okay, so that's just a little sample of it. But there's a few things that what do you notice about that audio?
It seemed very natural, very good actually, and very interactive, or basically engaging, like two people are talking in reality. It felt like that.
Yeah, it sounds remarkably realistic as synthesized voices go.
Yeah.
And did you notice they threw in filler words like and so forth? And you see coming up pretty regularly. The types of things we tend to edit out of our podcasts are put there to make it sound more like human speech. Yeah. And also there were some breathing sounds, some interruptions, and it was the vocal inflections were very realistic. And if you listen to more of it, sometimes they overtalk each other. They talk at the same time, just as humans might when they get excited talking about something. So it does a remarkable job. And it took about, I think, somewhere between a 35 and 40-minute podcast and converted it down into about I forgot how long it was, but I think it was about 15 to 17 minutes or so, which is a typical length of most of these things. Okay, so Any questions on this so far?
So the way I'm thinking of using this method is right now I'm teaching a capstone course, and because it is online asynchronous, the instructions are that I would have given in a class of 50 minutes or an hour and 15 minutes. I have actually written down those instructions, in a very easy way for my students to. It's very interactive, and it's like I'm talking to them. And I'm thinking people do not want to read instructions that long because it might be like 3 pages long, 4 pages long kind of a thing, because I'm also explaining things in those instructions. So maybe I should actually use a podcast method through this, convert those instructions into a podcast and see how it does. And I can, like you mentioned, instead of doing the whole thing, maybe I can ask the podcast to emphasize certain things which I feel are important. And maybe students can actually would hear it and actually follow those instructions. That's what I'm thinking.
It's a nice way of summarizing things in a way that's very informal, but pretty well done. It does a pretty accurate job of summarizing the material that it's given. So doing that with a syllabus or something similar could be really effective. Any other thoughts? Well, I played around with a few of these. I also took an article from the Chronicle, as I mentioned before, from Vijay Sathi and Kelly Hogan. And again, this is the podcast I created. And once you create it, by the way, you do have to log back in with your personal account or connect to your personal account each time, because it'll default to your Oswego account if that's your primary account on the machine. But here's what it did. And again, you can play all these and see how they
Hey,
go.
everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Whether you're a teacher yourself or just really care about making education more equitable, well, this one's for you.
Absolutely.
We're diving deep into how to make your teaching more inclusive.
Yes.
It's by Vijay Sathi and Kelly A. Hogan.
Great book.
And they are experts in this field.
Yeah.
They've got some really practical advice for us.
For sure.
So think of this deep dive as like your toolkit
Yeah.
for reaching every single student in that classroom,
Yeah.
no matter their background or how they learn best.
Absolutely. And this is so important because, let's be honest, the way teaching has traditionally been done
Right.
often leaves some students behind without even meaning to,
Yeah. Yeah.
But the great thing is Safi and Hogan give us this clear path
Okay.
to bridge that gap and like build a learning environment where everyone thrives.
I like it.
Right.
So they start by tackling those big questions head on.
Yeah.
They're the ones like, hold on, isn't inclusive teaching just hand-holding? Or what about the students who are already doing great? Won't this hold them back?
Yeah. Yeah. And their answer is a resounding no on both counts. That's what I love about their approach.
Yeah.
They emphasize that inclusive teaching.
Yeah.
It isn't about lowering standards or like giving anyone an unfair advantage.
Right.
It's about creating a level playing field where everybody has the support they need
Okay.
to succeed.
I got you.
Think of it like building a ramp alongside a set of stairs.
Okay.
It doesn't make the destination any less challenging. It just provides multiple ways.
Okay, so again, it does a pretty nice job. This is summarizing the article, and it makes a reference for the book, Inclusive Teaching. You probably don't want to put in, as suggested just a few minutes ago, you might not want to have it summarize a whole book, unless you just want to get a really quick overview, the type of thing you might find in publisher's page describing the book, or an Amazon abstract or a summary of the book. But for small chunks of information, for articles, maybe for a chapter in a textbook, or even just some concept that students are having trouble with, or if you ask them to read journal articles or working papers and so forth, that may be perhaps a little bit above their understanding level, this will summarize it in a format that is very intuitive, that's very easy to understand and very easy to listen to. So it works. I was amazed the first time I saw this working.
Yeah, no, I was amazed too. Have you had any issues with accuracy in summary, or changing of the ideas, or misinterpretation of the ideas?
It could. I mean, it's possible. I haven't. It's done a pretty good job of summarizing the main points of the articles. It could, though, because it is generative AI behind this. They're using the Gemini engine behind this in order to generate that. But if you don't like the way it comes out, you could always create a new version of it where you ask it some guided questions or you give it some feedback and it will make some adjustments in it. So it's good. It's important before you share it to listen to it to make sure it is accurate. But in general, when it's trained on specific materials, just like with ChatGPT, when it's given something specific to use as its primary source, it generally doesn't have the same type of hallucinations it would if it was just drawing from its general database of knowledge. So it's possible. And I always recommend listening to it first. And it's not terribly long.
Yeah. No, I actually find these kind of things very helpful for students. So let's say I asked them to read 2 books, which of course I will not, but let's say I did, which were 600 pages each. I mean, sometimes even a summary is good enough. You really do not have to read every sentence of that book to have a discussion in class. A summary helps quite a bit, and it's better than the abstract that you get online. So I really like this whole thing. I wonder if there is an app for it on your phone too.
I don't believe so. I haven't checked in the last few weeks, but a couple months ago, when I was looking for that directly, I haven't seen it. You might be able to do it though, just using Chrome on your phone, but I'm not sure. I've only done it with laptops.
Yeah.
So, but that's worth exploring.
Yes, absolutely.
This one is
So
just
this
kind of,
will,
oh, go ahead.
sorry. So you are able to give it more specific feedback. It'll go back and make changes to like a specific part that you might want to change, or would it just re-record the whole episode?
I would probably regenerate it. I don't know if it will go back and make specific changes. I don't think so. I think you pretty much have to go back and redo it. But you could put in specific directions in the prompt so that it focuses on certain things, and you can ask it not to address certain issues if the output is problematic. So you can focus it a bit, but I don't think it will regenerate. I think I misstated that. I don't think it will regenerate directly unless you basically ask it to do again with a more specific direction. And one way of doing it is just list the questions that you want it to focus on, and then it will focus the discussion on those specific questions. And it does that quite well. Because it might pick up on things that you don't think are that important, and you want students to focus on a certain thing in an article. So just put those types of questions in there, and that'll be the primary focus of it. I wish I could be more precise on whether it will regenerate. I don't think so, but play with it. It's a pretty nice tool, and it's really easy to use. This one, by the way, I put in just for fun. Bastiat put in, Bastiat put in this petition to the on behalf of the candle makers. Basically, it was an interesting thing suggesting that the candle makers at the time, back in the early 1800s, were facing unfair competition from the sun. So he proposed that windows be banned or heavily taxed, and other things, basically to introduce protectionist policies to make everyone better off. Because it was basically a satirical piece analyzing free trade. I had assigned this in a class I taught at Duke one summer to a group of really gifted high school students. And there were only 2 students in the class who recognized that it was a satirical piece. But when I put this when I gave it this feedback, this is what happened. And again, I'll take just a few seconds to regenerate the audio.
All right, so get this. We're diving deep today into a satirical economic argument from the 19th century.
Oh.
You might be thinking, like, what could be relevant about that today?
Yeah.
But trust me, this one's a gem.
Okay.
We're looking at Bastiat's Candlestick Makers Petition.
Okay.
It's this satirical open letter by French economist Frédéric Bastiat, written in 1845.
Right.
And it's basically about a group of candle makers who petition the government to block out the sun.
What?
Yeah, you heard that right. The sun.
Wow. That's pretty out there.
Right.
It sounds ridiculous,
Yeah.
but that's the power of satire, I guess.
Yeah.
Bastiat uses it to just brilliantly expose these flaws in protectionism,
Right.
which is the idea of favoring domestic industries
Yeah.
by shielding them from foreign competition.
Okay, so picture this. You're a candle maker in 1845. France life is good.
Okay.
Business is booming. Everyone needs candles.
Right.
Until this new competitor shows up.
Uh-oh.
They're flooding the market with their product, driving prices down. And the worst part is they're giving it away for free.
Oh, my goodness. Who's this competitor?
This competitor, of course, is the sun.
Oh, okay.
Okay, this just seems somehow relevant in a world in which we seem to have forgotten some of the lessons of 18th century and 19th century economics, where we are putting up all these trade barriers. But the fact, what I was impressed by is that they recognize and begin immediately with recognizing that this was satire. The interesting thing in that particular class, again, they were high school students, highly gifted, but high school students. They thought the whole argument was somewhat bizarre, but the only two students who actually recognized it as satire were both from Taiwan. And it was interesting that the non-native speakers picked up on it while the domestically born and trained students in our schools didn't recognize that. But the podcast did. So I was just kind of impressed. Now, one of the reasons why we put this session together is because it does create an alternative format. And we know that when students see material in different contexts and presented in different ways, it increases their learning. It's creating more connections for them. They're seeing things and hearing things a little bit different. They're hearing different voices. They may hear you talking about something, sometimes hearing an explanation in somewhat different language in a different framework can help reinforce that, because sometimes some arguments will connect better than others, and this is automatically doing that. And the same is true with reading the text, reading the issues, or watching the videos and getting this alternative summary, which is much more interactive and actually remarkably engaging for something which is synthesized like that. So it's a simple way of creating multimodal learning. So instead of just having students read things, watch videos, listen to recorded lectures or other things, they're just getting one more way of connecting with the material. And we know that storytelling is a much more effective, is a really effective way of communicating. That, stories was how we transmitted information from one generation to another before we had much in the way of written communication or ways of preserving writing over time. So, from an evolutionary perspective, storytelling has been pretty important, and it's something that we really tend to connect to. Stories are often much more engaging, or narrative is much more engaging than reading a textbook or something similar. And also, it's just one format that can work really well while you're doing other things. If you're walking around out in the freezing cold, if you're driving, commuting, if you're exercising, doing laundry, washing dishes, or other things, you can listen to these things as long as you're not doing something else that has a high cognitive load. It's just another way. It provides an opportunity to learn a little bit about something at a time when you wouldn't be able to do that if it was only available in a textbook or a video for that matter.
So I'm assuming then the file can be downloaded on the phone in that case, correct?
Yes, you can download it as an MP3 file, and then you could just put it in Dropbox and play it from Dropbox, or put it into any music player app and play it from there.
Perfect. Yeah.
And it also can take complex text, relatively complex scientific articles or research studies, and summarize them in a more intuitive format, which can help students get past a barrier. If they're having trouble understanding some of the complexities of an article, it can summarize the main points to give them a framework on which, when they go back and you want them to read it more carefully, it at least gives them a starting point about what's important and why the study is being done. And that sort of framing can be really helpful in letting them see how all the details in the papers fit together in terms of what's important and so forth. So it can be really, really helpful. And I'd encourage students to do this, not as a replacement for reading the text that we assign, but just as a way of getting a little bit more help with things that they find more challenging.
Yeah. I'm actually also thinking that this might be very helpful for students, international students. And, students or people who have learned how to pronounce things by reading, because I'm assuming this is US pronunciation, and therefore it will help them, use certain words, certain vocabulary, and what is the correct pronunciation for that. That might also be helpful for some people.
I still, after being around for quite a while, will sometimes run into a word that I've only seen in writing, and I don't know how it's pronounced. And especially for second language learners, it could be, as you said, really useful in just letting them hear the terms that they may have only seen in writing. Because, when you first study a language, you don't get access to the full vocabulary right away. You might be able to recognize a word on the page, but if you've never heard it said, it's kind of hard to address. So that's useful. Yeah.
And how would it do with, for example, let's say there's a French word in here, or some other language or Russian word in here that is used all the time, or Latin phrase that is used all the time. I wonder if it does the correct pronunciation for those two. Maybe I can try that.
Yeah, I don't think I have any, the samples, the experiments I've done with this, I don't think any of them were done with words that were not English. I mean, there may have been some exposed or, other things in them, but I don't remember those coming through into the transcript, or into the audio, but it could. And I wouldn't be surprised, because there's so many tools out, and given Google's ability to do this, I wouldn't be surprised if it could also, at some point, I don't think it's there now, but if it could also regenerate this in multiple languages, because there are many, many tools that will do that now. So that's not a feature built in, or at least it wasn't when I looked at it before, but it could be interesting. Yesterday, when we were doing a workshop on creating GPTs, where you created a chat bot that you could give to students to use as a tutorial, one of the questions someone asked is, well, what if someone's not a native English speaker? Will it work? And so Stephanie was there, and she typed in, she gave it a query in French and Spanish, and it responded in French and Spanish using the same tools. So I wouldn't, now that was just text responses, but I wouldn't be surprised if they do the same thing audio, because Google Translate's been a really effective AI tool for quite a while, and it keeps getting better.
Yeah, thank you.
But it's not there yet, but I suspect it will be really soon.
Yeah, very soon, exactly. I mean, they're learning, they're changing things every day.
Now, I was going to focus a little bit more on this because I saw some posts about this being better than Podcast LM, but Podcast LM has improved quite a bit since I put this description together, 3 or 4 weeks ago or a month ago, and Illuminate hasn't really changed quite as much. But if you'd like to play with it, it's another podcast creating tool, which is somewhat similar, but it doesn't have, it's an experiment. It's a Google Lab thing. And here's some examples of it, but it generates things only from websites. Originally, it only did it from PDFs, but now it will do it from web addresses. So you put in the web address. A couple of things that are a little bit different is that you can, if you go to the freeform thing, choose from a set of voices for both the host and the guest. And you can get casual or formal or guided versions, where the guided one is very much like the ones based on questions. And the free form gives a bit more flexibility, including a number of different voices you can use. But I did put in together a couple of examples in here just to illustrate it. At this point, I'd say probably that the NotebookLM is probably more useful, but I did have it use that same source material and had it generate a casual podcast and a more formal technical one aimed at more formal audiences with fewer filler words, with less vocal inflection and so forth. But it's something else you can play with. It doesn't generate the quizzing materials and the feedback, the timelines, and the other things, though, that NotebookLM does, at least not at this point. So it's an experiment. One thing I did notice is that it is you can't query it. You can't ask questions about it once it's summarized material. And with NotebookLM, once it's read something at the same time when it's creating the podcast, you can also use a chat interface and query the document, ask questions of it, and it will respond in text responses. But this will not. However, it's much faster. That when I tried creating things with Google Illuminate, it took about half the time. But again, even then, with NotebookLM, I don't think any of them took more than 4 or 5 minutes, but this would do it in 2 or 3 minutes or less. Now, if we go back here, at the very beginning, we used, let's go back here. I think we can go back. Yeah. We created a new one here, and it was on the higher ed daily briefing on your enrollment rebound. So, and here's an interactive mode, which I tried it last night and it didn't work. It's in beta. But we can load the conversation. And this is a podcast that was created right at the beginning of the session. And it's right here. And see, here is where you can do the queries. So you could ask them. It gives you a few samples to begin with, but you could also put in others, and it is going to respond to this based on what it found in the article. Okay, and here is the final podcast. This one's a bit longer. It's 22 minutes and 55 seconds for a relatively short article.
Welcome back, everybody. Ready to dive into higher ed again? Got some fascinating stuff from the Chronicle this week. Lots to unpack. Remember how everyone was freaking out about freshman enrollment dropping? Yeah, well, it just turns out the number did a complete 180. Yeah. But we'll get to that a bit later. First, let's talk about the elephant in the room. President Trump's back in the White House, and let me tell you, he's been busy shaking things up when it comes to colleges and universities. Big changes.
Yeah, big changes indeed.
First up, he revoked a bunch of executive orders that have been around for, well, ages. One of them, from way back in 1965, has had a huge impact on how colleges hire faculty and staff. Talk about a blast from the past.
Definitely.
He also signed a brand new executive order that basically calls for investigations into what they're calling private sector DEI activities.
Okay.
And guess what? That includes universities, especially the ones with those massive endowments.
Right. And, you know, a lot of legal...
Okay, that may not be the most cheery topic. I should have picked one in advance. But in any case, that's the podcast. And here we could create a study guide of this, although I think we may want to go back in our shells.
So, John, the
Yes.
kind of sentences like white elephant in the room or something like stirring things up, were those in the article, or the podcast actually interpreted them as that way?
It interpreted them that way. So
Okay.
it basically uses a lot of colloquial expressions and so forth. And,
Okay.
and again, that makes it a little bit more enjoyable as a listen than, well, let me rephrase that if you have to read something about what Trump is doing, it may be at least a little bit less harmful hearing about it in this more informal manner than reading through it and just getting more and more disgusted.
Yeah.
Not to, state opinions on this, but it's a really great tool. You could have it summarize the news in the morning, or whatever. Or if there's a podcast that's really long you don't want to listen to, feed the audio to it and let it give you a shorter summary. Take some of the podcasts I really enjoy are like an hour and a half or 2 hours long, and I rarely have that long to listen to them because there's a cost to that. But if you took the podcast audio and put it in here, it'll generate a 15 to 18, or in this case 20, almost 23-minute summary.
And it also depends on what is your commuting distance. So an hour long would be but if you live very close to the place, then 15 minutes podcast is perfect, actually. At least you get a summary of everything and you do not have to have any kind of breaks in it.
So again, one of the concerns that, a lot of people have is that students are using shortcuts. The more control voices. Okay, so that's it as far as the slides. But yeah, one concern that, a lot of people have is that students are using shortcuts for all of this, that students are going out and instead of reading articles, they're getting AI summaries of them. And there are many, many tools that are being actively marketed for students to do that. Instead of taking notes in classes, they're recording the classes and getting an AI summary, which are often really accurate, but they're kind of wasting their time while they're there if they're not directly although that can help for students who have some learning disabilities and so forth. Having a transcript and so forth can be a useful tool. For students with hearing issues, it can be useful getting it in a more friendly format if there is no transcription or other things taking place otherwise. But when students aren't reading the articles themselves, they might be missing a lot, because a 15-minute summary of a 30 or 40 page working paper or article will not contain as much detail, and those details can be important. So it's important to emphasize to students that developing critical thinking skills and close reading skills and so forth is useful, but this can help them get past some barriers if they're not understanding something. I teach a capstone course where I generally ask students to read 5 or 6 journal articles or working papers every week. And in there, some of them I try to find ones that are fairly accessible for students without, as much math as perhaps the authors of the articles are using. But, it might help for them to run it through here to get a simple summary. So,
yeah.
Any other thoughts on any of this? Using it for a syllabus was a great idea. I hadn't thought about that, but it could be really useful.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm thinking about doing it, because I'm the AI fellow too. So tomorrow when we meet, probably that's on my mind to do it. I'm also thinking, like, students who are passionate, who are passionate about the topic, will definitely go to the original source, and they have always done that. Even in 90s and 80s. In early 2000s, when these things didn't exist, they always would go to the library and basically sit down and read and read and read. I think AI tools are important for other students who are not that passionate, yet they also want to learn, right? And it kind of starts the process for them. And if they find their passion in any of those topics after listening to it, they will, of course, go to the original source sometime in their life, if not necessarily now, because ultimately it's a gradual process. It's part of growing up. That's how I see it now. So I personally think that anybody who's an average student, AI tools can be very, very effective for them. They may not be as effective for people who are, on the other extremes, people who are not doing well, or who do not want to do the work at all. Even AI cannot help them. That's what my thinking is.
Great. Tyler.
Yeah.
I think a lot of good points were made, especially on the disabilities front. I know that I specifically had 2 students last semester that they were dyslexic, and even a 10-page article could take 2 hours to read. A 10-page article, that's probably a 15-minute podcast. Especially if it was, 100, 200 level class, that could be a really good solution for the, both great kids, just they couldn't process material as quickly in that format. So from that front, I think it's a great accessibility thing.
Agreed. I think we'll find a lot of use cases. Or even if you're doing your own research on something, if you find 10 or 15 or even 20 articles on it, you could feed it in there and get an overall summary of all that, which might be at least a starting point if you don't have time to read all those articles yourself. Then you can always go back, and if it seems like there's something worth exploring in more detail, you could do that.
Yeah. It can also be, John, it can also be introduced in combination with, the audio, like any AI that can actually read the book for you. So it can be used in combination. Like if somebody just want to do a podcast version, fine, but then the longer version is available, or word-to-word version is also available. So do you know of any AI that can actually help in reading books? Other than Google Read or whatever, I know there are certain things, read aloud, that's available.
There are many that will take digital text and read them and summarize them. I mean, ChatGPT will do that in general, or Claude, or, and pretty much any of the big, large language models will take books, as long as they can be in a format that it can read, as long as there's a text layer in there, it can read them and summarize them. There was an interesting thing Tyler Cowen, an economist at George Mason University, did, is he wrote a book over a period of several years, but he released it a year ago with a ChatGPT interface. So he made the book basically an interactive book where you can query the book using the interface, which has been trained on all that. So it's an interesting situation. It's something that we might see more of. We might see more books come out with an AI interface so that you can directly ask questions of the book. I mean, you can always create your own, but it's kind of nice that that's already there as a tool. If you go to the URL, you can directly get to it.
Yeah, but ChatGPT and Claude, they cannot be used on your phone. That's the concern here.
I'm sorry.
Can they be? Can you ask them to read aloud on your phone as well?
Yes.
Oh, really? Maybe I need to try that then.
I haven't tried it on Android devices, but I do have it on my iPhone, and it will work really well. In fact, the advanced voice mode for ChatGPT, especially, I think it's available for all users now, but it has been available for paid users, is something that works remarkably well.
Okay. Let me see. Yeah, I have Android and I do have a free version. So let me see if it works well for me.
So it may. That I don't know about the Android version, but the iOS version is remarkable. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, we can stop here, but I'd encourage you to play with it. Just try it. It's really simple. You just find things, put them in it, let it generate, and then listen to it and see how it goes. And again, it's probably worth encouraging students to at least explore these tools, because our students are generally more familiar with AI tools than most faculty are, but not all of them are. And some of them are kind of reluctant to try it, but they can be really helpful, especially in terms of accessibility issues. So
yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. And we'll be back in 10 minutes, 11 minutes with our next session. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John. Appreciate
Thanks, John.
it. Bye.